When it comes to the season of Advent, what immediately comes to mind in terms of preparation, perhaps things like meditation, doing acts of penance, that type of thing. But there's actually really specific advice given to us in the gospel. Perhaps most famously on the lips of St. John the Baptist, right, where he says, "Prepare the way of the Lord and make straight his paths." Now, I know that particular passage is so familiar to the point of almost being kind of cliche, but it is actually immensely practical in terms of telling us what to do to engage in this stance of preparation during the season of Advent. And so the image that immediately comes to mind is kind of a modern image, but hopefully you find it helpful, is that of a helicopter. So imagine a helicopter trying to land in an area which is remote, which so desperately needs the supplies contained in that helicopter. So right away you can drive a lot from that particular image, right? And so our task, our job, is not to build the helicopter. It's not to pilot the helicopter. It's not even to summon the helicopter. The helicopter already exists. The helicopter is already coming. In a certain sense, the helicopter is already here trying to land. So again, hearkening to the foundational notion of Advent, which means, of course, coming and presence. The already, but the not yet. Now, our task in that particular situation is to clear the landing field, to remove anything which might constitute an obstacle which would otherwise prevent the helicopter from landing on the ground. And you see, the whole point is that once you're clear about that particular image, that particular aspect of Advent spirituality, it should open up all sorts of possibilities in your mind as to what you should do and what you should not do. Now, if you happen to be a regular attendee at Weekend Mass when it comes to any of the churches that I service right now currently, you might notice that I often phrase this particular concept in terms of focusing on the few things the Lord wants you to do carefully and well. This invitation to live the focused life, the intentional life, to focus on things which are important, things which are essential, instead of focusing on things which are evil, things which are wicked, but even things which are merely good, but which have the net effect of actually wasting our precious time and energy. Now, that said, the thing I want to impress upon you in the context of this particular reflection is that when we speak about focusing on the few things the Lord wants us to do carefully and well, it's not simply to please the Lord in the abstract. There's actually a very practical and tangible benefit which occurs to the people of God if we choose again to focus on the few things the Lord wants us to do carefully and well. And so to further illustrate the point, the example that comes to mind is a short video that I saw in the context of YouTube on the subject of burnout. And so basically in the context of the video, which was pretty short, only about a minute, there was a psychologist who was talking about his own experience with burnout. And so essentially what he said, just to kind of paraphrase, was that he nailed basically three things, three key strategies to pull himself out of a state of burnout and back to a state of wholeness and completion. And so the first point that he basically raised was this notion of simply taking away the junk, removing anything which was not important, not essential in terms of one's daily tasks. Now, for yourself, even when you reflect on that particular concept, even for a moment, perhaps what immediately comes to mind are work obligations or family obligations. But in contrast, perhaps I might suggest to you something else, which is kind of nuanced, a little bit subtle, but actually really common. So as a starting point, I often think about the words of Sister Miriam James Heidland, who says that hurt people often hurt people. And we encounter this all the time, of course, right? And so imagine there is someone who has been emotionally hurt back in the day as a result of not having been loved in the way that he or she should have been loved. Sometimes the way that plays out in the context of this person's relationships is that they become somewhat demanding. So I demand that you respond or attend to my pain or my needs in this very immediate sort of way, short of which I will accuse you, whether consciously or implicitly, that you don't care, and that maybe on top of that, you're a bad person. Now, obviously, because this particular human phenomenon is so common when it comes to interpersonal dynamics, we have to be compassionate. We have to be kind and compassionate when it comes to people who are struggling with this particular difficulty. At the same time, we have to protect ourselves in the appropriate way in terms of setting up healthy boundaries. And so let's say, for example, that someone comes to you in their woundedness, in their pain, and they implicitly demand that you act a certain way to alleviate or otherwise address their pain. If it's something that you truly want to do and you think that it's actually appropriate and right for you to help this person in this way by responding in the way that they ask, by all means do that and feel good about the fact that you're doing it. On the other hand, if you feel that by making this particular choice, you are compromising your own sense of integrity, identity, and freedom, well then maybe you have to think twice and recognize that if you constantly give in to people in this way, perhaps that's something you need to change. So maybe that falls in the category of something you need to take away, something you need to remove to free up your mind and just your life to do the things you actually want to do, the things that the Lord actually calls you to do. In any case, that brings us to the second point, and that's basically this. It's really important to make sure you're not adding on to your already complicated list of things that you should be doing, which again is no small thing. Now, again, when you hear this particular point, perhaps what immediately comes to mind are work obligations and family obligations. And certainly that's true. That's a really common area of life where we tend to kind of pile on our obligations. But perhaps I might add on to that this notion of psychological noise. And so think of it like this. Because life is often so difficult and painful and stressful, we automatically develop all sorts of coping strategies. And in particular, we often develop all sorts of attachments to cope with our stress, to cope with our pain. And so, for example, think about sexual sin, binge watching on TV, eating chips, that type of thing. But more to the point, an attachment which is often overlooked, but which is immensely common, is this attachment to, again, psychological noise, which is basically to say this. A lot of times, if you think about it, we ground our sense of security, not so much on money, not so much on things, but our worries, our stress, our, again, psychological noise. And so the thinking goes kind of like this. As long as I'm worried, as long as I'm stressed, as long as I'm actively trying to balance various things in my mind, I feel safe. I feel like I'm doing something. I feel productive. And that feeling makes me feel more assured in the midst of my difficult and challenging circumstances. Now, obviously, when you say it like that and you kind of bring it out in the open, perhaps it might sound kind of silly, but therein lies the point, right? When we're very intentional about naming these things which are burdening us, in terms of, for example, writing these things down on a piece of paper, we name these things, we gain a certain control over the things which are otherwise burdening us or holding us captive, and thereby gain the possibility of becoming free of these things through a simple task of simply becoming more aware. In any case, that kind of brings us to our third and final point, which is basically to say this. It's really important to schedule into your day, into your routine, things that you like to do, things that you like, things that you love. And so the example that kind of comes to mind to further illustrate that particular point, I remember once hearing a story on the lips of Father John Ricardo, where he was talking about this fisherman who was approached by this tourist. And so basically this fisherman was by the dock and he was smoking a pipe. And so the tourist came by, saw him smoking a pipe, looked out into the ocean, and kind of said to the fisherman, like, basically, this boat that's in front of you, is this your boat? The fisherman said yes. And so the tourist said, well, you could be in this boat, you could be fishing along with the others. To which the fisherman said, yeah. And then the tourist went on to say, well, like, look, if you got in your boat and you went out to the ocean and you started catching a bunch of fish, you could make a lot of money. To which again, the fisherman said, yeah. And then the tourist said, well, then after that, you can come back here and just relax. In response to which, the fisherman basically said to the tourist, well, that's basically what I'm doing right now. And that's the end of the story. A lot of times we're so attached to our busyness, our stress, our psychological noise that we never stop to kind of pause and think, is this the sort of life that God wants you to live? Is this the sort of life that I want to live? And obviously that's one of the great graces when it comes to the Advent season. This invitation, if not this commandment, to prepare the way of the Lord by clearing away from your life and your heart anything which constitutes an obstacle to you becoming your true and authentic self. Because here's the thing. The more that you actually live the life that God wants you to live, in terms of going the way of trust and letting go and accepting, the more you discover your true and authentic self. And through that discovery, find the one living and true God. And may God bless you all.